All right. We have been doing a study on Esther. And if you have your Bibles, and you want to know an easier way to find it, it's the book right before Job. And on Wednesdays, when I do the Bible studies, 99% of the time, Dave uses the King James Version usually, and he reads whatever verses I ask him to read in the King James Version. And then Josie, what'd you say, Dave? Yeah. Well, I ask them if they would help, and sometimes it's just Dave, Josie, and me, and so that works out fine. We have enough for each one of us to have a microphone. So we've kind of gotten in a habit to do that, and then I'll ask Josie to read from, and she's been using, we're trying to use different versions so we can get kind of an idea of what they all say. Well, not all of them, but several different ones. And she uses the Living Bible, and then I use the Amplified Bible. And we take turns. Sometimes we'll take one or two, we'll take a verse and we'll read all three versions of that verse and then talk about it. And then sometimes we do a whole chapter in one version and the next chapter in another version, and we do it a little bit different each time, but the main idea is we're trying to see the different ways it's worded, and we're trying to get a little bit more out of what we're reading and discuss it and see if we can come up with things that maybe we've missed before because we were just reading and we weren't really looking that close at it. And I'm not real good at studying it quite like Chuck and John and Jim, and going to, I try to do a little bit of that, but they're the experts, and Robin's an expert at taking them apart and getting in there and really getting into the word and studying like the lexicon and all these other things. And I do good just to study one version against another version and look up the meanings of some words. But anyway, so I know I miss a lot, but if I can get people encouraged to look at it more, because I don't know about you, but there was a period of time when it was kind of the thing to read the Bible from cover to cover and see if you could get it all done in 1 year. And they had the different programs you could go on that would split it up to tell you how much to read each day to accomplish that. And I don't think I got on any of those programs, and I don't think I did it within a year, but I have read the Bible through at least once. And then the rest of the time I pretty much took like a book or a chapter or a verse or something and studied that, but on my own. But just because you read it from cover to cover doesn't mean you understand what you read. And I know you've probably experienced this too. I have read some things in the scripture many, many, many times, and then all of a sudden it's like the light bulb goes on. Oh, that's what that meant. Or someone will get up and preach on something, and they'll approach it from a different angle than what at face value I take it as, and bring out something that's like, I've never thought of it that way. But yeah, I understand that. So I think it's good to study. I'm not a preacher, and I did at one time think I wanted to be a teacher. In fact, most of my growing up years, that's what I said I wanted to be. Then when I was a teacher, circumstances happened that changed my thinking. So this is the closest you're going to get. So thank you. Josie's trying to give me a word of encouragement there. So anyway, the last Wednesday, we looked at or examined Esther chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3. And if y'all remember the story, there was uh, King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, some people call him. Um, he, well, when I read chapter 1, to me it looked like he was showing off in front of his buddies. He called a banquet, and they had a banquet for the men that was directed by the king, and one for the women that was directed by Queen Vashti, or Vashti, however you want to say it. Vashti, I think is how I was told to say it. And anyway, he wanted the queen, unprepared or unplanned, to come and flaunt herself in front of the guys at the banquet. He wanted to show her off because she's very beautiful. Well, she's also very independent, and she decided she wasn't coming. Back then, you don't do that. If you don't obey the king, you run the risk of losing your life or losing your position or something. You just don't go against the king, whether you agree with him or disagree with him, matter not. He's the king. And she refused to come. And so he ended up dishonoring her by saying, "You are no longer the queen. You have embarrassed me in front of my buddies," basically is what he was saying, even though I didn't really say that in scriptures. But basically he was saying, "You've embarrassed my honor and my position." And the guys that were with him agreed that something needed to be done that was drastic, because otherwise, people look to our leaders for examples of how to be. And he said, they said, "Well, Queen Vashti won't come when the king comes, then who's going to honor the king?" Not only that, but the wives are going to stop honoring their husbands, and the kids are going to stop honoring their father, and so on and so forth, all just because Vashti wouldn't come when you called her. So she lost her crown. I don't know what happened to her after that, but she lost her crown. And then, so then they decided to call a bunch of I'm sorry?
Sometimes you wonder what
Yeah, use your
Sometimes you wonder what happened to him.
Right. I don't know whether they sent her to be with the concubines or what they did with her. They were trying to dishonor her like she dishonored the king, so it's hard telling. It doesn't always tell us everything. But anyway, so they gathered up a bunch of virgin girls, and Esther was one of them. And they spent a whole year preparing to go before the king. And then he was going to choose one of them to be the new queen. And I think that's is that in chapter 2, I believe. Yeah, I believe that was in chapter 2. Anyway, so they spend a whole year preparing to be a queen, which it talks more about their beauty than anything, but I think they also had to learn mannerisms and charm and different things, etiquette and stuff that was expected of a queen during that year process. But they also had to have a lot of oils and stuff put on them to make their skin beautiful and so on and so forth. And so it was a year process. And I don't remember it saying how many young girls they had, but out of the young girls, Esther got chosen. And Esther was an orphan, so you wouldn't have expected her to end up being of royalty. She wasn't born into royalty. She was chosen. And she... Get my thoughts gathered here. They're going in 20 ways all at once. She was Jewish, and she was an orphan. And her uncle was in charge of her. Her uncle Mordecai was in charge of her. And when she went to go prepare to go before the king, Mordecai had told her, he said, don't tell anybody that you're a Jew. And so she didn't. She was very obedient to him. And I got to thinking about it, when I was the age that she was, and I'm assuming she was probably 16 to 18 years old, something like that, when she had to go get prepared to go before the king. She probably had dreams of her own. Maybe she even had a boyfriend. Who knows? But when the king calls, you go. Doesn't matter if you like it or not. Doesn't matter if it messes with your dreams or not. You go in obedience. Anyway, it doesn't mention anything in the scriptures that I could find to show that she was complaining about it. They considered it an honor, I suppose, to be chosen by the king. However, it's not quite so honorable if you're not the one that's actually chosen to be the queen, because you get put in a harem afterwards. So you're kind of there with the concubines, but which isn't as important as a queen or a wife. But anyway, she eventually gets chosen, and he shows her favor. He considers her the most beautiful of all the girls that came before him, and she's the one that got chosen to be the new queen. Then in chapter 3, it starts setting up what's about to happen. And we're introduced to Haman, who gets his authority established over all the officials who were with him. He was in a high honored position with the king, and we get introduced to him, but he's got a pride issue. And I forget exactly how it came to pass, but he was told that everybody was supposed to pay homage to him whenever they came close enough to him to do so. They would bow down to him or bow to him or whatever. And of course, Mordecai, being a Jew, he wasn't going to do that. The only one he bows down to is God. That's just the way it is. Cut and dry. And he's not trying to be disrespectful to anybody in authority or that's supposed to have honor, but the only one he gives the honor of bowing down to is God. And he's stuck with that. Well, so that caused Haman to dislike him greatly. And so greatly that he was trying to figure out a way to get back at Mordecai. And I guess he found out he was a Jew, so he was trying to set things up to where there was a decree out that would be issued. And at the end of chapter 3, there's a decree issued out that on a certain day, Mordecai and all the Jewish people, men, women, children, babies, were to be killed. That was in King Xerxes' kingdom, or Ahasuerus, whatever you want to call him. It seemed like everybody back there had more than one name. So that's where we are right now. And I just want to bring out the fact that when you are chosen, while you're going through this, you may not recognize it, but God is setting things up. He's setting the stage up to where you are put in a position to do what his plan is. And so that's what he's doing with Mordecai and with Esther. He's setting things up to do some things through Esther and through Mordecai. So now we're on chapter 4. And in the King James Version, would you mind just reading the whole chapter, Mr. Dave, so that we're not here till midnight? So when we do it one way, we are here longer.
Verse 1. Chapter 4 of Esther. When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes, and put on sackcloth with ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and cried with a loud and a bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting, and weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told it her. Then was the queen exceedingly grieved, and she sent raiment to clothe Mordecai, and to take away his sackcloth from him, but he received it not. Then called Esther for Hatach,
Close enough.
one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed to attend unto her, and gave him a commandment to Mordecai to know what it was and why it was. So Hatach went forth to Mordecai into the street of the city, which was before the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened unto him, and of the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews, to destroy them. Also he gave him the copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and to declare it unto her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king to make supplication unto him, and to make request before him for her people. And Hatach came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Again Esther spake unto Hatach, and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whatsoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed, and who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. Go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way, and did according to all that Esther had commanded him.
Okay, now I usually ask for comments. I give the person who read the chapter a chance to do the comments first, and then if there's anybody else that has a comment, we'll get a mic over to you some way or another, and you can make a comment too. Does anybody have a comment about what they understood about this chapter?
Well, I would have to go over it again. But there's a lot of stuff in there. I mean, we hear about how that, you do it the king's way or else, and but then he's saying, I think I remembered him saying something about wait for the right time or something like this. I'd have to go over it again.
You have to go over it again. Anybody else have any comment off the top of your head right now? Okay. You, Josie? No? Okay, I'm going to go on ahead and tell you a few things that I got out of it. Of course, I meant to study this part and I didn't, but it's, if I remember correctly, and you correct me if you know better, know different. But the Jews, when they were deeply concerned about something, would rent their clothes and dress in sackcloth, and there were certain places they would go and maybe wail or whatever they did to draw attention to the fact that something was not quite right or whatever. And in this case, it was the King's Gate. You couldn't enter the King's Gate dressed in sackcloth, but you could be outside of the King's Gate, and that was if I understood correctly, a very public and well-traveled place going in and out of the King's Gate. And when Esther was made to know that Mordecai was very upset about some news he got, she inquired about it, and when she found out that there had been a decree made that was on such and such day, the Jews, her people, all of them were to be killed. And she had this Hathach, however his name is. Anyway, he was the messenger that went back and forth between Esther and Mordecai. And this messenger, she told this messenger, Esther told the messenger to remind Mordecai that anybody, even the queen, if they went before the king unannounced, without him calling them to come to him, ran the risk of being killed. And you either got the golden scepter raised to you saying you could come on in, or you didn't, and if you didn't, then you were put to death. And so she wanted him to know, this is dangerous, what you're implying that I need to do. You're wanting me to go before the king. He hasn't called me in 30 days, so I don't know when he's going to call me or if he's going to call me. But it may not be soon enough. So, but if I go to him first, before he calls me, it may still have a bad result anyway, because I could be killed for not waiting until he called me. And so she reminds him of that. Well, then he sends the messenger back to her, reminding her that, whether you do this, yes, you're taking a risk doing this. This is dangerous for you. But either way, you could be killed, because if the king doesn't change this some way in our favor, then you are a Jew also, and it will be found out, and you will be killed as well. So you can die dishonorably, or you can die with honor, whichever, is basically what he's saying. And and he reminds her that, we don't always know. His reminding her of this makes me think that maybe they had discussed this before she went in the group with a group of women to prepare to go before the king. I'm sure she and all the other young virgins were asking, why am I chosen? Why am I in this position? Why is my life having to go the king's way instead of my way? What's going on here? Why is God allowing this? Because I don't know if the rest of them were asking why is God allowing this, but she possibly was, because she was a Jew, so she believed. And but he brings this out, that perhaps this is why you were put in that position, because God knew you had the courage to do what you needed to do to save God's people. Perhaps that was his plan. Jeremiah 29:11 God has a plan for each and every one of us. Sometimes we don't know what that plan is, and sometimes we do, and sometimes we figure it out on the way. So, so once they got to this point, it's quite clear that she decided she could not do this on her own. She needed God's help. And the way they usually did was they would fast and pray, and they'd have quite a few of them doing the fasting and praying together for the cause of whatever it is that they were pleading before God. And that's what she called together. And she wanted Mordecai to gather up some of their people as well, not just Esther and her maidens. And so she had a lot of people praying and fasting for God to help them. And that's where chapter 4 ends. So now we're ready for chapter 5. Josie, would you read that, please, in the Living Bible?
Okay. 3 days later, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court just beyond the royal hall of the palace where the king was sitting upon his royal throne. And when he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her, holding out the golden scepter to her. So Esther approached and touched its tip. Then the king asked her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." So she had pretty much won him over. And Esther replied, "If it please your majesty, I want you and Haman to come to a banquet I have prepared for you today." The king turned to his aides. "Tell Haman to hurry," he said. So the king and Haman came to Esther's banquet. During the wine course, the king said to Esther, "Now tell me what you really want, and I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." Esther replied, "My request, my deepest wish, is that if your majesty loves me and wants to grant my request, that you come again with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I shall prepare for you, and tomorrow I will explain what this is all about." What a happy man was Haman as he left the banquet. But when he saw Mordecai there at the gate, not standing up or trembling before him, he was furious. However, he restrained himself and went on home and gathered together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, and boasted to them about his wealth and his many children and promotions the king had given him, and how he had become the greatest man in the kingdom next to the king himself. Then he delivered his punchline. Yes, and Esther, the queen, invited only me and the king himself to the banquet she prepared for us, and tomorrow we are invited again. But yet, he added, all this is nothing when I see Mordecai the Jew just sitting there in front of the king's gate, refusing to bow to me. Well, suggested Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends, get ready a 75-foot high gallows, and in the morning ask the king to let you hang Mordecai on it. And when this is done, you can go on your merry way with the king to the banquet. This pleased Haman immensely, and he ordered the gallows built.
He sure is full of himself, isn't he?
Yeah.
Does anybody want to make any comments about this chapter and what we learned?
There's a saying, I believe it started with Napoleon. This is the actual words, I can't remember, but it goes along like this. Don't interrupt your enemy in the midst of destroying themselves. That's the quote. Don't interrupt your enemies in the midst of destroying, or in the middle of destroying themselves. So their plans will be used against them. And that's what God is doing.
Doing that today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this story has a lot of similarities to it. The way she comes to doing this, I can't help but believe that after the fasting and praying, that's how God inspired her to handle it. And the way she called Haman and the king together to the first banquet and then the second banquet, it shows how it puffed him up, because he jumped to conclusion it was to honor him. We have to be careful about jumping to conclusions. We have to be careful about trying. I used to like, and I still do catch myself doing it, I like to guess what somebody is thinking or what an animal is thinking when it does certain things, and it's amazing how many times I'm wrong. But assuming gets us in trouble. And he's assuming that, wow, even Queen Esther is showing him honor by letting him come to or inviting him to these banquets. And he's ready. God is building the whole scenario up, and Haman's going to get a big surprise and a big lesson in the humility thing. He's all puffed up. It's all about him. If nobody does what they're supposed to in his opinion, then they need to go on the gallows. And that's what he's wanting Mordecai to. He's not happy with Mordecai not bowing down to him. So, all right, that gets us to chapter 6. On that night the king could not sleep, and he ordered that the book of records and memorable deeds, the chronicles, be brought, and they were read before the king. It was found written there how Mordecai had reported that Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who were doorkeepers, had planned to attack King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes. And the king said, "What honor or distinction has been given to Mordecai for this?" Now, and that happened earlier. I can't remember if it's chapter 1 or chapter 2 or chapter 3, but it was in the first 3 chapters where that happened, and I forgot to bring that out as in my summary. But anyway, he said, what kind of a thank you have we given to Mordecai for saving my life by bringing this to our attention, that these guys were wanting to attack me? And the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing's been done for him." So the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to ask the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows which he had prepared for him. The king's servants said to him, "Look, Haman is standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" Now we've already talked about Haman and his pride issue. And of course, he's thinking the king's trying to find out how he could honor Haman for stuff he's done. But he doesn't want to just come right out and ask him, so he's asking him, kind of indirectly. And so he says, "What is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" So Haman's thinking, well, what would I like to have done? Whom would the king desire to honor more than me? Such a conceited guy. So Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king desires to honor, let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. and let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let him dress the man whom the king delights to honor in the royal robe, and lead him on horseback through the open square of the city, and proclaim before him, 'This is what shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor.' Then the king said to Haman, 'Quickly take the royal robe and the horse, as you have said, and do this for Mordecai the Jew.'" Can you imagine how Haman felt? No. "Who is sitting at the king's gate. Leave out nothing of all that you have said." So because of the king's order, he's got to do the exact opposite of what he wants to do to Mordecai. So Haman took the royal robe and the horse and dressed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the open square of the city, proclaiming before him, "This is what shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor." Wow, talk about a lesson in humility. This is not how Haman had planned it. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his own house, mourning and with his head covered in sorrow, and probably in shame and embarrassment. Then Haman told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise counselors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall in status, is of Jewish heritage, you will not overcome him, but will certainly fall before him." While they were still speaking with him, the king's eunuchs, attendants, arrived and hurriedly brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Now, I hadn't planned on going on to chapter 7, but we do have time to do it if you want to get out by 9. But if you want to get out just a little bit sooner than that, we can take prayer requests and pray over everybody's prayer request. We can take comments from whoever wants to make comments. I kind of made them as I read it for my comments. First, you tell me, are you wanting to go home by 9 or earlier? Whichever, huh? I guess I'm directing it to Josie, Butch, and John, because y'all have the farthest to go. Dave and I don't have very far to go. We could walk it.
Well, it's up to me. Well, I hate to be a party pooper.
That's okay.
Yeah, I probably do.
You want to get home? Okay. Well, we do need something to study for a week from today,
Yeah.
for those that come, so that's fine. That's fine. I just want to be thoughtful, because some of you work, and I think Josie now works on Wednesdays, and so she's fighting it, but she's back there yawning. And Butch has already tried to fall asleep on me, so. There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. And Chuck always told me, he said that I sometimes talked him to sleep. And I said, well, then you know what to do. If you have a hard time sleeping at night, you come get me, and I'll talk you to sleep, and I'll start talking, you'll be asleep in no time. So it's kind of a little bit of humor, but the truth as well. So, okay. Anybody got any more comments about what we read so far through chapter 6?
Well, it really has brought out a lot of stuff that I didn't know more about Esther, and what happened I did know some, but not intensely like this, So it's really good. It's really a good story.
I really like stories like this, that it brings it home to some of our situations. And when we have stories like this, it shows us that, yeah, they felt fear too, but they didn't run from it. They faced it, and they depended on God to help them. And I find it amazing how, usually when you think of royalty like a king or a queen, you think of them being born into that position. And it brings out she was an orphan. Orphans weren't looked upon very highly. And of course, as you can see, a lot of the people in that particular kingdom didn't look too highly upon the Jews either. So she had 2 counts against her. And then she's young, and she probably had plans of her own, which got foiled by this whole thing. Nothing turned out the way she planned. And if she complained, it doesn't tell about her complaining. It only tells about her stating a fact about the danger she was in if she went before the king without being called. That's the closest to complaining that I've been able to find so far. So,
It also amazes me how this story can kind of copy what's going on in the world today, with the presidency and what they want to do and everything. So, it just shows me that God is still in control and can turn it around any time,
Amen. Yep. He's bigger than all of our, well, it's like a song. He's bigger than all my problems, bigger than all my fears. God is bigger than any mountain that I can or cannot see. Bigger than all my questions, bigger than anything. God is bigger than any mountain that I can or cannot see. Bigger than all the shadows that fall across my path. God is bigger than any mountain that I can or cannot see. Bigger than all the confusion, bigger than anything. God is bigger than any mountain that I can or cannot see. He's bigger than all the giants of fear and unbelief. God is bigger than any mountain that I can or cannot see. Bigger than all my hang-ups, bigger than anything. God is bigger than any mountain that I can or cannot see. Shows how important being obedient to God and believing and trusting in Him is, whether you're talking about Bible times or now.